The first black U.S. Secretary of State, Colin Powell, has passed away following COVID-19 complications. His family made the announcement on social media saying the 84-year-old passed away this morning. Powell served under 4 U.S. presidents, going from being a soldier in Vietnam to becoming the first black U.S. security advisor. According to his family, he was fully vaccinated against COVID-19 at the time of his death. Well, to reflect on the legacy of Colin Powell, we're joined by International Relations Professor John Stremlau. Professor Stremlau, good evening to you, and thank you so much for making time for us tonight. So one of the things we've heard is just how significant Colin Powell was in shaping American foreign policy. Speak to me a little bit about that.
Yes, he certainly was very influential, but I'd like to make a point about COVID because he had a multiple melanoma, which is a blood cancer that made him particularly vulnerable, so that even though he was vaccinated, it was not the case that the vaccines were ineffective. The fact was he had a morbid precondition that had prevented him getting a booster as he had planned to do. So I don't want anyone that's watching this show to think that they shouldn't get vaccinated against COVID. As for Powell himself, it really is a sad moment for me because there was a time in the 1990s he was the most popular man in America. There was no question about that. And he almost ran for president, so that he had been the first and youngest black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He had been the first, as you suggested, national security advisor. And he became later the first Secretary of State, but he could have been the first black president. And he decided not to run against Bill Clinton in 1996 because his wife Alma was against it and because he didn't have, as he said, a fire in the belly. But I can remember serving in George Bush 1 during the Baker period under Secretary Baker, and when the decision to roll into Iraq to reverse the invasion of Kuwait was taken, Powell was magnificent, and he was competent and serious and always on top of his brief. And I remember taking him to sign a copy of his autobiography in 1995, and I brought our daughter along, and she was just gobsmacked by his charisma and presence. So this is a sad day, and I don't mean to go on so long, but I cared very much about Powell, and I understand that his copybook was stained by the false intelligence that he put out during Bush II Jr., and he regretted that very much. But at the time, he thought he was telling the truth.
And we'll talk about that in a second, Professor Stremlau. Interesting that, you have a period in the early 90s where a black man would have been considered even for the position of president, when we look at how long it took, even after that, Barack Obama to finally be the first black U.S. president. That means that there must have been something really special about Colin Powell. Speak to me a little bit about those characteristics that left perhaps some of the American population thinking, well, maybe this could be the guy to lead us.
Well, I should qualify this response by saying that I am against American adventurism, as was the case in the invasion of Iraq in 2003 when he was Secretary of State, although the decision was driven by the White House and by Bush and Rumsfeld and Cheney. But nevertheless, I am not a military man, but I liked Powell's approach to the military role. It was always measured. He was always the most reluctant to go in. He was very reluctant to reverse Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait when Bush, the father, was president. And he insisted that we do it in a very measured and careful way. And he also wanted to have allies backing the U.S. to the hilt before he would go in and approve. He would take orders from the president, obviously, but he was always a very straight shooter in my experience. And that's, I think, what commended him. I frankly was happier seeing Barack Obama in the White House. And Powell supported Barack Obama to his great credit, I think, and was very, very critical of Donald Trump, so much so that Trump disparaged him. Powell called Trump a liar, and he was absolutely right.
Despite the fact that, with the benefit of hindsight, he may have regretted the position and perhaps even just that report that led to the Iraq war, the consequences of that war have, really changed the course of history, not just for America, but I think globally as well. What does the significance of that then have to do with the fact that his legacy has this big blot on it because of some of those decisions?
Well, this is politics and the accidents of politics, because Al Gore should have been the president in 2000, close election. He did carry Florida, but a Supreme Court judgment, which was a predominantly Republican judgment, 5-4, gave it to George Bush, W. Bush. And I was impressed by W. Bush's response initially to the 9/11, but then Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld pushed for the invasion of Iraq. And for all I knew, sitting out here, because I was asked by media often, did Saddam Hussein have nuclear weapons? And I said, well, the intelligence seems to suggest that he had that capacity, but in fact he didn't. And Thabo Mbeki here knew perfectly well that he didn't, because South Africa had very good intelligence, but I didn't learn that for some time afterwards. It is what it is. It's politics that are made up in the historical moment, and I think it's good for media to remind us that oftentimes there are very near misses, and history could have been very, very different. Had he beaten Bill Clinton in '96, he would have been very different if Bush had lost to Al Gore, but that's history.
And the reality is, again, upon realizing that report on which the decision to go into Iraq was not entirely accurate, as far as you know, Professor Stremlau, were there any steps that he took to try and correct that, or even advise further on what then the course of action needed to be, given the new information that had come to light?
Well, Powell didn't stay on beyond the first term as Secretary of State. Condoleezza Rice succeeded him. And Powell has publicly, and it does stain his record, the unfolding of the nation-building project in Iraq was an outrageous failure and a disaster for the region as well as for the Iraqi people. But so too was the long decision to stay in and build the nation of Afghanistan. America was able, after the Second World War, to help the Germans and the Japanese rebuild democracies, real democracies. But that was a one-off, particular historic moment. And there's a lot of people who are now looking at that and thinking back to whether or not it was the right thing to do and how the trials of the Holocaust were handled. But that's what history and academics are for, is to make sense out of history after it's happened, and we've had a little distance because the heat of politics makes some bad decisions, and the U.S. has had a series of them that has undermined its credibility in the world. I mean, that's what Joe Biden's challenge is to rebuild American credibility, but he's being hampered by the Republicans who are still Trump supporters. You know that.
So, Professor Stremlau, then, again, just on the issue of the political divide, right? We have Colin Powell, who served mostly under Republican presidents, and you've just mentioned how during the time that Barack Obama was running, he publicly supported and endorsed his candidacy for president. Was there an ideological shift that he went through, as just from what you can tell?
Oh, from what I can tell, he's like the rest of us who take seriously studying of international relations or foreign policy. He made an intelligent decision. It was a very courageous one. He will not follow the pack. And he moved increasingly to the Democratic Party. And Trump was really his undoing. I mean, in the sense that he was no longer a Republican after Trump, and said that he had no home in the Republican Party that would nominate a liar, a con man, and a cheat and a racist, as Trump's own lawyer later testified in Congress. America is going through an identity crisis, not unlike the South Africans went through in the early 90s. But because African Americans have been oppressed for a long period of time, but are in a minority, it's taken a while to sort of come to the surface. And this is the last throes. This is a testing time for America, as you know as well as I do.
Professor Stremlau, let me thank you for your time, and again extend my condolences to you, given how you've been personally affected by the loss of Colin Powell and, of course, the rest of the American people tonight.
Thank you very much.